The cattle auction cracked open the afternoon like a drum. Heat shimmered above the pens, sweat salted the air, and men shouted numbers as if volume could turn dust into money. Sundown Street had emptied into this pen of spectacle. Cruelty liked an audience here, and the audience liked to be entertained. It was the kind of scene that forced the town to look at itself without blinking. The perfect place for a story to nail down its first stake and turn all heads in one direction. Ruth stood at the edge of it, neither hiding nor courting notice. She carried a shawl more thread than cloth, and a stillness that made people itch. Her mouth tasted of coin and iron. The swollen lip, the old bruises yellowing at the edges. Sundown had written its opinion on her skin for weeks. She had learned the script: hush when the sermon starts, yield the path when boys travel in a pack, count your change twice because the grocer won't count it once. She had not learned to bow. The town called that pride. She called it breath. Greeley, the butcher's cousin, all elbows and grin, stumbled into her path with the self-assurance of a man who had never paid for his laughter. He smelled of old fat and easy victories. "Move," he said, and when she did not move fast enough to flatter him, he put a palm to her collarbone and shoved. Ruth hit the dirt in a tangle of skirt and hay. Applause didn't erupt, not exactly. It rolled around the railings as a low, pleased murmur. Someone hooted. Someone spit. Greeley stepped forward for the second blow, already smirking because the first had gone down so smooth. There was no reason in his mind that the second would go any different. Celis Work stepped down from the rail. He did not rush, he did not announce himself. The crowd's sound thinned as he walked, and a seam opened through which the day's heat bled quietly away. Black hat low, jaw set, licorice working in his molars, Sundown knew the shape and weight of this man. They called him the Black Ram not for the cattle under his brand, but for the way he took a hill, straight, without angles, and once. He stopped between Ruth and Greeley and looked, first at the hand that had shoved, then at the blood shining on Ruth's lower lip like a readied seal. "You done?" he asked. Greeley grinned wider, because some men mistake patience for permission. "She ain't your concern." The punch landed like an argument that had found its final sentence. Greeley folded, knees first as if to pray, and then flattened as if the prayer had been answered in the negative. The murmur died. The auctioneer's hands froze mid-gesture over a lot no one would remember. Somewhere a calf bawled, thin, bewildered, honest. Ruth sat up on her elbow. She did not thank Rourke. She did not say anything at all. She looked at him the way a person looks at a new tool, weighing, not admiring. He offered his hand. She let that hand hang in the space between them like a question. Pride in Sundown was a man's word, a permission slip for bad behavior. Dignity was the word she kept in her mouth where no one could find it and break it in half. So she rose without his help and faced him, the blood clotting at the corner of her mouth, chin lifted not to invite a blow, but to refuse its echo. This gay would not humiliate her, not for the crowd, not for the story told after. It would mark a turn, not a spectacle of suffering. Celis looked at her, at the gravel stuck to her palm, and the calm that didn't ask for witnesses. "Ain't charity," he said at last, the words plain enough to carry. "Ain't pity. I need a wife. I'm tired of looking. Say yes, and you'll never be struck again." The sentence fell into the pen like a stone into a trough. No flourish, just wait. Everyone heard the terms. Everyone understood the promise. In a town that treated safety like a rumor, he had offered a contract in front of witnesses. The choice was hers, in the only way choices are real, with cost attached. Ruth tasted iron again. She read the room without moving her eyes. The preacher's wife had covered her mouth not in horror, but to hide the shape of her smile. The sheriff studied the scuffed toe of his boot as if it become a document. Boys leaned forward with hunger for whatever happened next. Men shifted, making space for a decision. She thought of the long nights behind the blacksmiths, wind tugging through split boards. She thought of coins skimmed, of the chapel pew scraped foul, of every look that had weighed her like meat. She thought, too, of the lock that she had seen on the door in Rook's hallway, the kind of lock used by people who have learned the value of closed things. She did not romanticize any of it. She ran the ledger against her ribs and listened for the number that made sense. Ruth nodded once. No speech, no bargain, no vow beyond the one he had set and the one she carried, that she would not be broken in public ever again, not for their sport. He dipped his head a fraction, in recognition, not victory. A murmur rose, curiosity turning its head to catch the light from a new angle. Somewhere a gavel tried to reassert the day's business and failed. Rourke kept his hat on, took her shawl from the dirt, shook the worst of the earth from it, and set it over her shoulders without brushing her skin. "Evenin'," he said, which was not a promise and not a threat. A path opened through the crowd the way water opens when something with a keel passes. He did not touch Ruth's elbow. He did not guide her. He walked ahead at a pace that assumed she would follow and allowed her not to. She followed. At the edge of the pen she glanced back at Sundown. No one met her eyes. Good. She didn't want witnesses for the walk away. She wanted witnesses for the line she had drawn. The spectacle had done its work. The flash had hooked. The story would move backward to explain it, but the town had already seen enough to talk about for years. That night, a paper would be signed with a squeaking pen. Before that, there would be a silent ride, a house with a closed door at the end of a hall, and a stew cooling on a cold stove. But the scene did not end at the threshold. It ended here, on dust, with blood drying to rust at the corner of her mouth, and a promise sitting steady in the air. Decision made. Ledger balanced. Curtain down. The Rook house rose out of the hills like something that had decided long ago it would not fall. Timber dark as riverbed stone, windows squared like watchful eyes, a porch that kept its splinters to itself. Ruth stepped over the threshold and let the cool air swallow the heat the road had stitched into her. The room smelled of iron, soap, and a stew cooled past appetite. A hallway tunneled away from the front room, and at the far end a bedroom door wore a brass lock polished by use, the kind of shine only sorrow or habit can make. She saw it and said nothing. Seeing was enough. Celis spoke the way he did most things, plain, without garnishes. "Pumps in the yard," he said, tipping his chin toward a back window. "Cellar steep, watch the third step." He stood like a man who belonged to the house and not the other way around. He did not touch her, did not hover at her elbow, did not ask if she could cook or pray. He pointed to a peg by the door. "Hang your shawl there. Wind steals." Then he took his hat, put it back on his head, and went out to unhitch the horse with a care that made even the leather seem to settle. In the morning he left before dawn. Ruth woke to the sound of a match scratched into life and caught the brief picture it painted. His face in amber, the line of his jaw, the eyes that did not search the room for anything they weren't ready to find. He nodded once at her waking, a courtesy that felt almost like a pact, and stepped into the gray. The house exhaled after him, a hitch in the breath of old boards. Ruth sat up, thread of hair coming loose from its pin, and listened to the quiet. It sounded different here, less like an accusation, more like a room politely waiting its turn. She learned the house with her hands. She boiled water and scoured the kitchen until the grain lifted its clean scent. She threw the windows open and scrubbed sun into glass. Watched the valley come in as if it were a guest with better manners than most of Sundown. Behind the pantry she found a narrow room with a broken rocker and a ledger of cattle brands marching back to a year she didn't own. Beneath a lifted floorboard, a tin held hairpins and a child's glove, the thumb worn thin by some small life that had once reached hard for the world. She put the tin back exactly where it had been. The house had given her its secret. She would not spend it. He returned at dusk with wind in his coat and the day on his shoulders. He ate standing, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, as if chairs were luxuries saved for winter. He left his rifle on the table and oiled it without the reverence some men give their weapons. When she coughed, he set down the cloth and the bottle and brought water from the pump without comment. When blisters rose along her palms from wringing lye across the floors, a pair of gloves appeared on the table the next day, the leather soft and stubborn. He spoke little. He didn't need to. Silence, properly kept, is a language. Town learned quickly. The black hat at Ruth's shoulder kept the street from crowding her. The beatings stopped because consequences had ridden into the equation. The boys who jeered found their words tasted different with their teeth loose. The sheriff discovered his vest buttons required focused attention whenever Ruth walked by. The ache in her posture unknotted by fractions. She still kept her eyes down in stores, and her change counted twice, but she walked whole. One evening she asked for a rifle. The request left her mouth like a small straight nail. Celis looked at her, thinking long enough that the moment could have grown teeth. Then he nodded and brought up the Winchester from the cellar as if he were carrying a sleeping child. "It'll knock you down the first time," he said. "That's how you know it wants your respect." It did. Dust caught her laugh when she hit the ground, a sharp, startled thing she barely recognized as her own. He did not smile, but he offered his hand to help her up, and when she didn't take it, he only loaded another round and stepped aside. By leaf yellow he had taught her the fences and the draws, the cattle paths that braided the ridges into scents. She could shoot a knot from 40 paces and gut a squirrel neat as a seam. He never praised her, and she did not look for it. The work was the praise. On clear nights they sat on the porch with tin cups of sweetened whiskey and watched the sky arrive. The quiet stretched, not taut, not slack, a rope that would hold. Winter bit down hard. A blizzard took the west fence and 7 head, and the hands left, one with a note, one with only the shape of absence. They wrapped scarves over their mouths and hung lanterns from their belts and moved through the white like 2 stubborn ideas. They slaughtered what hay wouldn't keep and salted meat until Ruth's knuckles cracked like old paint. When she slept, Celis stitched the splits with a needle and a patience he pretended was practical. The letter came in January, carried by the preacher's boy on a pony with more ribs than sense. Which, the paper said in neat loops, a curse upon the town, a bloodletting cure. The preacher had offered his pulpit to the roomer, and then claimed the roomer had misused it. Celis read the page once and fed it to the stove. In the morning he saddled 2 horses and rode into Sundown with Ruth behind him. He walked into the chapel and spat on the pulpit. "Lay a hand on her again," he said, to the rafters and the man beneath them. "I'll put this town down like a sick dog." He left before echoes could decide what to do. That night a dead rabbit hung from their door, nailed ear to ear. Ruth took it down, scrubbed the blood from the wood with hot water, and leaned the rifle against the bed. When she lay beside him, she turned to face him. He did not move away. The space between them changed its shape. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was shelter. Down the hall the locked door kept its vigil.
Not all rooms owe you entry. Some only owe you honesty.
Spring leaned its shoulder against the hills, and the land breathed, not soft but easier. Ruth rose before light, laced her boots without fuss, and met Celis at the yard gate where the rails wore the shine of years. He adjusted her stirrups without comment and handed over his old boots as if they belonged where they were going. She wore trousers now. Skirts had too many ways to betray a rider. The house watched them go, square and unsentimental. They worked the line like two hands on the same robe. He fixed wire and posts, showed her where the rock outcrops funneled wind into trouble, how a cloud's shadow could lie about distance, how a calf ball changed pitch when it turned from complaint to danger. She learned the far names: North Draw, Devil's Elbow, Bitter Spring, the high pasture where the grass kept back a secret sweetness even in mean years. He listened to the sky, and she listened to the ground, and between them the herd kept its confidence. The first rider came while Celis was out on the eastern fence. Ruth opened the door with the rifle resting easy against her thigh. The man wore a crooked hat and a grin that had learned its swagger from other people's pain. Whiskey and Old Sweat came in ahead of him. "Didn't know the Black Ram kept a new ewe," he said, eyes slipping over her like grease. He took a step toward the threshold. She lifted the rifle a breath higher. He stopped. Not courage failing, calculation changing. "Tell your husband I came looking," he said. "Debt rides faster than pride." He turned his horse with a jerk and left dust to finish the sentence. She told Celis when the sun burned low and coppered the porch boards. He leaned back, fingers lace-locked, face lined by shadows of things that did not belong to this house. "He's not wrong," he said. "I owed him once. I don't any more." The words were clean and useless. Ruth did not ask names. Questions sometimes spend a currency you might need later. But she began to watch the ridge the way a hunter watches a creek, patient, waiting for what the water brings down. The fire started on the eastern slope at midnight, ran bright as insult and quick as blame. They split without speech, he for the line and she for the barn, sloshing veils over old wood, flinging wet burlap across the hay door, beating sparks like flies. By dawn the flame lay down, but the fence was gone in 3 long bites, and 4 heifers stood blackened to bone near the creek. On a flat rock someone had carved a word with a dull knife and a sweet tooth for humiliation. Celis came back sooted and shaking. He did not speak. He sat with the rifle in his lap and sharpened its bladeless edges until his fingers bled. Ruth wrapped his hands in clean cloth and tied the knots tight enough to hold. They rode into Sundown, not for justice. Sundown sold justice by the thimble, but for names. Inside the saloon, the piano lay silent under dust. A drunk with a lesson to teach glanced up, saw Ruth, and grinned slant. "Witch has got herself a ram," he said. Celis broke his jaw so neatly the room noted the craftsmanship. The sheriff studied a knot in the floorboard that demanded, apparently, the full force of the law's attention. Out behind the livery, they found a boy with freckles and new stubble, the kind of age that still folds into apology when faced with consequence. Ruth stepped close enough for him to smell lye and smoke on her. "You ever put a boot near our land again, your mother will bury you by sundown." The boy's fear arrived honest and wet. He nodded and learned his first real limit. For a handful of weeks, Sundown tucked its teeth back into its mouth. But men from beyond the ridge keep books of an older kind. The name arrived on an oil-stained sheet nailed to the barn door. Jebediah Crane. Celis read it and sat down hard like the porch had been yanked a foot lower. "He's not a man," he said, voice gone gray at the edges. "He's a plague in boots." He finally unfolded a past he had kept folded to keep from cutting himself on it. Fields burned, cattle lifted, a life ridden hard and changed only by the refusal to keep paying for it. "You can run," he said, quiet. "Take the mule. Ride east until the land forgets your name." Ruth listened the way she handled a knife, carefully, by the hilt. "You think I walked through that door to run out the back?" she asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The shape of the question carried the weight. They set their waiting into motion, livestock into the high pasture, Ditches dug near the barn where oil tins lay sleeping beneath a thin crust of dirt. Shutters and lamp wicks cut short. Ruth slept in her boots. Celis kept a pistol on the night table like a confession. 5 riders came at dusk and did not speak. They let their shadows lie against the house long enough to make the air choke, then drifted toward the ridge like smoke too stubborn to dissipate. A dead cow with its tongue cut out waited at the creek the next morning, a signature you could not mistake for anything but amusement. Ruth cleaned the rifle until the rag came away with nothing left to take. Celis said, "Fence tomorrow," although both of them knew tomorrow meant something else now. On the 4th night, glass rang in the kitchen and scattered across the floor like sleet. A second bullet struck the fence post where Ruth's hip had leaned a moment before. She fired from the porch and dropped a horse that screamed like a rusted hinge. Men shouted, smoke smeared the dark into moving pieces. Celis took a bullet through the shoulder and did not fall, emptying the revolver into the sound of Crane's laugh. She saw him then, tall, coat swinging, that grin like rot with teeth. Her shot tore a strip from his side. His shot scorched her shoulder and filled her mouth with copper. The night bucked and then went hollow. Dawn found blood on gravel. Not enough for an ending, enough for a map. Celis folded into fever before noon. Ruth boiled rags, packed the wound, watched the ridge until the light went thin. On the 3rd day, she put hardtack, a canteen, and Celis's knife into a sack. He tried to rise. The bed held him. "You don't know what he is," he whispered. "I know what he isn't. He isn't the last man to think he owns me." She slung the rifle and stepped into the saddle. The house, square and stubborn, kept its door open behind her until the road bent out of sight.
The trail north unspooled like a thin vein through bad country, and Ruth rode it with the mule's ears twitching at flies and rumor. The land beyond Carrion Ridge had no patience for people. It lifted red bones out of the earth and left them to bleach into warning. Wind combed the mesquite and whispered names of men who had ridden through here and come back quieter or not at all. She kept the rifle slung and the knife snug against her thigh, the scabbard warm with skin and intent. Her shoulder ached where Crane's bullet had kissed her, but pain steadied her. It set the sights of the world to one sharp line. Signs stacked up in the way the ground speaks. A heel print that dragged a little on the right, clay scuffed where a man favored one leg, a tuft of horsehair on a thorn, 3 black flies choosing a smear of dried blood on a gray stump. She took water in sips that made the canteen feel like a miser. Day burned down to wire. Night opened and narrowed, the stars cutting the sky into clean pieces a person could almost count. She slept in knots of shadow, boots on, hat down, the rifle across her chest like a bar. She dreamed of nothing. When the mule threw a shoe and the creek ripped her boots to leather ribbons, she walked until the rocks made maps in her feet and the ache climbed her shins like a ladder. She did not speak. Words in a place like this only wasted breath. By the 3rd day, the canyon's mouth widened into a basin, all thorn and ash, with a braid of water flashing meanly through the middle. Smoke wrote a thin letter against the dusk. Tents crouched around a low fire. Horses hobbled near the stream, heads down, switching tails. She counted silhouettes, one by the cookstones, 2 leaning into a private quarrel, another pissing into brush with his hat pushed back, and a 5th apart from the cluster, facing the wind, shoulders speaking a language that said he believed himself the center of whatever map he drew. Crane held himself like an answer he'd practiced too long. Ruth lay in the scrub and let her breath settle into the land's rhythm. She watched for patterns, who drank, who laughed, who checked his weapon with the fussiness of a man who's afraid to find out it won't save him. When the dark finally poured itself fully over the basin, she slid down the slope, a quiet darker than the rest.
The first sentry slept with his mouth open, a soft whistling that cut the night into even lengths. Her knife went in just under his ear. She turned his head with her palm and lowered him like a child being convinced of a better bed. The second man came out of the brush, fumbling with his buttons and pride. She put a bullet in his gut. When surprise turned to reach, she put a second through that thought before it could profess itself. The camp startled like a hive struck hard. Horses thrashed, fire spat sparks. Someone called a name that no longer had an owner. Crane did not run. He stood by the flames as if he'd been cast there. "They said you were pretty," he called, voice oily with contempt and theater. She stepped into the light so he could see the refusal on her face. "They lie easy in Sundown." He moved faster than his years should have allowed, a gun drawn like a magician's coin. His shot sheared cloth and skin. The heat slapped her shoulder and set her blood to a harder drum. She fired and watched the round cut air and miss, wind lifting the barrel's whisper a finger's width. They circled the glow, both of them reading angles, both understanding that distance would only prolong and not spare. "You think this is vengeance?" he said, grinning with tar-stained teeth. "You don't even know the tools." "I know the work," she said, and closed. The knife met his wrist, bright and quick. His blade met hers, a flash that said skilled rather than lucky. They fell into the dust in a tangle made of will and old decisions. He hit her face twice, hard enough to tilt the stars. Copper flooded her mouth. She bit his thumb until the tendon sang under her teeth and the bone gave with a wet, surrendering snap. His howl seemed to start in one century and end in another. She drove the knife under his ribs and pulled like she was opening a sack of grain. Warmth spilled, then weight. He made a gurgling argument and lost it halfway through. The last rider tried to become a horse's shadow. She shot once through the knee to arrest the future he imagined, and once through the head to finish the present he had. The basin went to a silence that wasn't peace, it was inventory. She kicked coals wide, fed canvas to flame, and dragged saddles and maps into the fire until the canyon walls licked gold and black. Heat stung her face and erased the camp's memory one crackle at a time. She took water, a coil of rope, Crane's revolver for balance, and left the rest to ash. The road back unraveled in Fever's handwriting. She walked crooked when the mule stumbled. She drank from the slick of puddles that worms trusted. She slept in thin slices and woke with the sense that something large and patient watched her from a branch. Twice she fainted into a dream of orchard blossom and woke to thorn. The wound swelled and wept against her shirt. She kept moving because there was no other verb worth the cost. When the ridge finally lifted the rook house out of the heat haze, her legs forgot their job. She fell into the yard and gripped dirt like a promise. Selas carried her inside and made rainwater into sacrament, washing the canyon from her hair and the knife prints from her hands. Fever climbed her and sat there whispering nonsense. He sat with her while day broke and mended itself 3 times. On the 4th morning, she opened her eyes and found his face where the light was kindest. "You're home," he said. "It's done," she answered, voice raw as rope. He nodded because the word "done" here had no argument left in it. She turned her head toward the window. The orchard was white with bloom, bees stitching the air into a soft, industrious hum. That night they shared the bed like 2 people who had carried something heavy to the same place and set it down. In the morning, she scrubbed blood from cloth, strung it on the line, set the rifle in its corner, and took the porch chair with the road in sight. Nothing came up it, no letters, no curses, only a quiet that had a new shape, heavier, earned, and entirely hers.
Summer sat heavy on the hills. the kind of weight that turned dust into knives and made cattle blink slow behind veils of flies. Ruth rose before dawn and rode the fence lines while the heat still had grace, her shoulder tugging with the old burn that Crane's bullet left behind. Scars had become the ledger of her days, not warning, not apology, only record. Celis moved slower now, a stiffness in his gait that argued with mornings and lost by inches. He dug post holes in careful pairs, and one evening buried his pistol beneath the cottonwood, tamping the dirt with the solemnity of a man swapping tools, not history. Ruth kept her rifle on its hook. Memory demanded upkeep. Sundown learned to speak softer without learning kindness. At the post, whispers lowered as Ruth entered. At the feed store, talk thinned into the weather-safe grammar. No boy spat near her boots anymore. No man nudged another with his chin as she passed. The story that mattered had ridden ahead of her and settled the crowd into prudence. A woman had walked into a canyon and returned with ash in her hair and quiet on her face. When a woman in a faded bonnet stopped Ruth at the hitch rail and asked, half hopeful, "You the one made the butcher's boy vanish?" Ruth's answer didn't blink. "No, I made him afraid to come back." It wasn't bravado, it was inventory. Autumn brought a girl up the road, more bone than voice. Bruises washed down her arms like ink meeting water. 14, maybe, and mute with the long silence people mistake for simple. Ruth opened the door because she recognized the posture of someone who'd run out of places to sleep. The girl took to shadowing her, studying the quiet trades, how to scald a floor until it smelled clean without turning the boards to lace, how to pare the fat from a hair without losing meat, how to keep beans from going bitter by patience alone. When the girl lifted the knife wrong, Ruth corrected her grip with the same unceremonious care Celis had used to set a stirrup. Weight low, wrist steady, no stories attached. Winter tightened the sky a notch. Ruth dug a new well with a pick, and the particular fury of someone who has decided thirst will never visit this yard again. Her palms opened. Celis stitched them while she pretended sleep. On a night wind sharp enough to cut, the girl woke at the kitchen table, striking matches and snuffing them, one after another, making a small, stubborn sunrise no one could steal. Ruth sat across from her, boots on the cold floorboards, and waited until the words arrived. "They buried my mama with her eyes open," the girl said, voice like a blade being learned. Ruth did not soften it. "You want me to dig her out?" A long shake of the head. The matchlight rested in the girl's eyes and went out. In the morning, she began naming cattle. Spring loosened the world's jaw and set bees stitching the orchard into industry. A new preacher came, young and hoarse at the throat, who read the book like it owed him pain instead of offering it. People listened because sincerity is rare coin even in places that claim to mint it. Celis, meanwhile, thinned at the edges the way men do when peace finally takes a chair in their chest. He still rode the south pasture, still mended gates, but let Ruth do the talking where numbers mattered. She paid hands without counting twice. She bartered feed without bending. They never said love and never needed to. The word would only have made small what their mornings understood. His coffee passed across steam into her hands. Her first sip returned like a blessing to his. Years worked around them, sanding corners into habit. The girl lengthened to 16 and rode alone with a surety that did not ask permission. At 18, she pressed the hot iron and didn't flinch when hide seared its answer. "You gonna name this place?" she asked one dusk, leaning into a fence post as if it might lean back. Ruth weighed the idea like a tool in the palm. Names don't keep a place alive. What it remembers does. Beside the old stone near the orchard stood another low marker, smaller, without inscription, the weather already working its eraser across grief. Ruth had never asked, and Celis had never offered. Their language lived under words. When time came for him, it did not bring thunder. It brought the small betrayals, stares that argued, breath that refused to lengthen. Ruth and the girl dug beneath the orchard, where the shade was honest. No preacher stood, no town came. They set him down where roots and secrets hold counsel, and Ruth cut a ram into the stone with a chisel and a steady wrist. Not letters, letters weather. A mark, deep as the work. After, the house stood exactly as before, which was the only mercy architecture can give. The well held, the wind learned the porch boards and sang them the way it had always sung. Word still traveled up the road when it had cause. When it did, Ruth met it on the porch with the rifle balanced easy and the girl at her side, a second silence matched to the first. Strangers learned manners at the gate. Old enemies found new opinions. The land, which at once tolerated them, now acknowledged them in the only way land knows, by answering their work with endurance. Evenings, Ruth and the girl sat in the last light and watched the sky reduce itself to useful darkness. Coyotes wrote their cursive in the draw and kept to the far side of the fence. Bees took stock at the hive mouth. The quiet no longer pressed. It rested. It belonged. There were no more beatings, no more public lessons administered by boys who mistook cruelty for wit. There was the ledger of days, mended wire, calved light, jars sealed against lean months, coffee shared against the cold. A place remembers what you make it remember. The ranch kept their marks, fire and blood, yes, but also the steadier things, a well dug by hand, a grave carved without words, a girl teaching the next calf its shape, a woman on a porch who would answer any knock with the truth.